Welcome to the channel, Cam, and thank you so much for taking this time and agreeing to an interview. Could you please introduce yourself and your channel to whatever extent you feel comfortable?
Hello, my name is Cambrian Chronicles. I'm from Wales, making Welsh history videos on YouTube.
And what
Thank you for that.
inspired you to do this? Where's your motivation coming from? Because this is a really niche topic, obviously.
Yes. Well, I think growing up, I found that there wasn't really a lot of discussion about Welsh history online and on YouTube in general. And not only that, but the stuff that was there wasn't always, the most accurate. So that was sort of my endeavor to try my best to sort of improve general knowledge of the history of Wales.
Yeah, we've talked previously about specialization in another conversation, and I mentioned the fact that I admired your channel because it is very specialized on a
It's
particular
very
topic, which,
niche.
yeah, it is very niche, but that's good because, as I mentioned to you, I think that that does give people confidence because niche history channels tend to take a much deeper dive into their area that they
Hmm.
of study that the area of study that they are presenting, which should give viewers more confidence about that. And you very clearly on your channel spend a lot of time on your research. And that brings me to my next question. Can you describe your research method and what quality control measures you take for your videos?
Yes, it's also sometimes a bit hard to describe. Is I find sources and using sources very important, as we've talked about previously. I try my best always to stick to the most recent stuff I can find. You don't go. You see sometimes I've seen channels cite stuff from like the 50s before, and
Right.
well,
Yeah.
Wikipedia articles on a lot of topics I've covered will have sources from like the 1800s. So I try to sort of go in the opposite direction. Make sure you keep it. I try and keep it as recent and up to date as I can. And then of course there's just general source criticism. Look at who disagrees with these people, different authors' interpretations of it, and just stuff like that. Really, I think. For me, like what I do, like I reference historians out loud a lot. If it's one
Yes,
particular
yes.
opinion, as far as I am aware, I've always said the name that that person has come from, because otherwise, like I feel like I'm just stealing their words, even if I
Exactly.
cite
That's
them in
right.
the text. Like if I
Mm.
don't say like, oh, according to so and so. I don't know if that was
Thanks.
very
That's no,
coherent.
that is actually quite useful. And I really take your point about age, checking the age of a source. This is
Yeah, I
something
think
I'm
it's
quite
something.
sensitive to, as you know,
Yeah, it's
from
something lay people
since
don't
I'm mainly
always
focused on
think
history.
about.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, that's right. I mean, you see people using sources in a very obviously undifferentiated way. And
Yeah,
some people obviously seem to think that anything published by a historian or anything published for that matter is worthwhile. And I'm particularly sensitive to that since some of the topics on the historical topics that I research are quite controversial, especially when they shift into political areas. And
yeah,
you have to be sensitive to where the scholarly consensus is at present and how that formed. I was speaking the other day with a really lovely young lad, Civil War Week by Week, who has an
all
excellent
right.
channel, again, very, very focused channel, and who does very, very good research. And I told him that I what I admired about his channel was the fact that he obviously spends a lot of time sifting and sorting through his sources because the sources for that event are wildly varied in quality and enormously
Yeah,
conflicting, especially because
yeah,
they're both on two different sides of the war, and both of them are highly motivated in their
yeah.
approaches.
That's not a
And
job I would
having
envy, to be
spoken with
honest.
him, that yeah, having spoken with him, I know he sometimes finds he just isn't sure, so he just has to
Mm.
just not use that source because he can't tell for himself it's reliable. And I really admire the fact that he takes so much time to do that. And I
Yeah,
appreciate
it's
anyone
very
who is
important.
dealing with the primary sources to that extent, in particular, you in particular, in the way you cite your sources and you're dealing with them in that very direct way. So, how do you select sources for a particular video?
In terms of primary sources or secondary or both?
Well, actually, yeah. Obviously, as you know, with my channel, if it's an area I'm familiar with, I will start very confidently with secondary sources because I will probably already know the secondary
Yeah.
sources and occasionally then go down to the primary sources. Again, sometimes I'm familiar with those sources. If I'm not sure, I would take a high level approach and go to the tertiary sources first, then use the tertiary sources to guide me to the secondary sources. And then when I think it's necessary, double check those secondary sources with reference to the tertiary sources, because sometimes I find that the secondary sources themselves aren't necessarily reliable. Maybe not
Yeah.
intentionally so, but the field has moved on. So you need to double check and say, well, maybe this primary source has been retranslated recently. I mean, translation is another
Yes.
scholarly
Yeah.
translations is something I want to make a whole video on, because as you would know, especially having studied sources in a different language, you would know that the difference, for example, between a popular level translation that most people will see and a critical text, which has
Yeah.
parentheses and lacunas and footnotes all over it saying nobody's really sure what this word means. It's
Yeah.
so
That
I'm
happens a lot,
interested in.
especially because Welsh is completely unrelated. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, no, that I mean that's a great example. I mean, sometimes you're going to meet hapax legomena, for which there is virtually only one extant source. I mean, it happens
Yeah.
in Greek and Latin often enough, but I'm sure it must happen also in Welsh. Some poet probably uses some word and he's the only one who uses it, or he's the only one who uses it in this particular context, and it's not exactly clear how he's using it or what it means. Do you
Yeah.
find yourself in that kind of situation dealing with these archaic primary sources, and how do you get around that? How do you deal with those conflicts?
Yeah, I do run into that a few times. I actually made a whole video about a topic similar to that, a use of an epithet that's found in very, very old Welsh sources that no one is able really to translate or really know what it means, because does the who it applies to isn't consistent, and the usage just sort of completely fell out of use. So we didn't. It's just sort of been lost.
Could you give me the name of that video? That would be a great one to put in my video description, and we can highlight that as an example of how you work through those kinds of problems. Let me look it up now. What was the name of it?
It was, let me double check, the royal title that no one can remember,
Oh, excellent.
with
That's
a
really good.
king, the
I'll make a
crown
note of
list
that.
still on it.
That's going to be really useful as a great example of, yeah, the kind of difficulty that you face far more than me when you're dealing with these primary sources. I think that's fantastic. There was another one I think that I saw of yours which I particularly enjoyed, which was similar in nature. And where was it? It was I think it was about a ruler who may or may not have. Oh, that's right. Yeah, Wikipedia's king who doesn't
Yes.
exist. Yes, I was really impressed with that one because
Oh, thank you
it's a
very much.
classic
It's a
example
personal
of,
favorite of mine.
yeah, I mean, it should be. And it rightly has over 1 million views. It's a
Oh,
great
thank you.
example of exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, how you had to really drill into the sources in order to find out the facts about this. Can you
Yeah, and that was
describe
a lot
how?
of primary sources as well,
Yeah, exactly,
because it didn't even
exactly. And I mean,
exist in the
dealing with
secondary
primary
sources.
sources, yeah, dealing with primary sources is always such a challenge, apart from the sheer volume of material you have to read, but the effort of interpreting them yourself. And sometimes, well, I mean, when I deal with a primary source in Greek and Latin, for example, as I mentioned previously, I
Yeah.
have a lexicon in one hand and I have a crib in the other hand in the form of a professional translation, and wherever I can, a critical text.
Yeah.
And and the amount of research that you had to do for that is extremely daunting, especially given the number of sources, primary sources that you had to go through. So, how did you how did you start? Where did you start pulling on that thread?
Um, well, I think it's a good example. It's basically the same process that you said earlier. Really, I was familiar with the era, so I started with the secondary sources, and
Right,
immediately fell on an obstacle because that person was not mentioned in anything.
right. Yes, yes. I remember now that you said that in the video. You found that source and you thought, okay, that's unusual. And then you started looking for other references and you thought, wait a minute, this guy's invisible. This guy's invisible in the
Yeah.
sources where he should be, right?
Yeah, and at that point, I'd put it on hold for a little bit because I wasn't sure where to go. But eventually, I sort of oh, I don't. It was a little while ago, but if, off the top of my head, I had to delve into some more of the primary sources and another work called the Welsh Classical Dictionary from
Right.
the 1990s, and just sort of go through every single name that began with an A, sort
Brutal.
of hoping to get some sort of, yeah, it
Yeah.
was a 20 pages, I believe, and it was the last name on the
Wow.
20th page, if I recall
Mm.
correctly.
See, that's the kind of primary source research and the level of dedication which viewers of the History YouTube community should really appreciate. And I think that a lot of viewers of History YouTube don't appreciate how much effort is being put in. And I'm not even talking about not appreciating the amount of work that goes into every video, because some of my videos don't take a lot of effort at all. They might take me a lot of time to synthesize the sources, but nothing like that, like kind of
Yeah, I
effort.
see what you
But
mean.
every now and then you hit a topic which just ends up blowing up far larger than you thought it would. And you kind of regret that you even started this, and you end up going down that rabbit hole. And I think a lot of viewers, even some of your own fans, wouldn't appreciate just the sheer amount of work that goes into most of your videos. People who are dealing with primary sources are spending enormous amounts of effort reading and interpreting and checking their work against extant scholarly interpretations. And I think it would be great, as I was mentioning to you in our previous conversation, if you made a video, just a short video like I've done, explaining the process of your research methodology and showing people so that they appreciate that. And this relates to the concept of differentiating between not just what we might call lower effort and higher effort YouTube channels, but
Yeah.
differentiating between history channels which are relying increasingly on AI content and those which are relying on
Yeah.
human generated content. Because as we both know, that AI content is becoming more prevalent on YouTube. And I think that it will be of great value for viewers of history YouTube channels to appreciate that the channels which are run by real humans and which are putting in that kind of effort are actually differentiable by virtue of that effort. But I think that our audiences sometimes need to be educated or informed of the sheer amount of effort that goes in so that they can appreciate what differentiates these human channels from the AI reliant channels. And in particular,
Yeah,
in
I
your
see what you
case, where
mean.
you obviously do so much primary research, I think it would be very valuable for your viewers to have an insight into that process.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It would be quite interesting to cover. I've had a few people comment before asking if I could ever sort of like go into detail about my
Right.
go into detail about my research process, as you said. And it would definitely be interesting. I'd like to go into it someday. It's I'm very bad at conveying how my brain works, but I'm sure I can figure it out.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested to hear that you had that question a couple of times, because I have received that a couple of times myself from my own audience, and which is why I've been making a couple of videos about research process and why I gave a demonstration in one of my videos about how I assess a source.
Hmm.
And I was really glad to see that. And I think that going forward, hopefully, there will be more interest in that. And I think that as history YouTubers, we should be making videos which encourage people to view history YouTube channels critically and help give them the tools to do that. Just
Yeah.
going to send you in chat a video which shows you the kind of report that I make when one of my patrons, for example, asks me to check a source for them and see if it's a good source or a high quality source. They say, okay, I found this book. I know it's been recommended, and I'd like to know if it's worth buying, or if I want to know if I can rely on this source for my research. Maybe they're doing some personal research of their own, or they want to write an essay or something like that.
Yeah, that's very
Or
interesting.
they, or it's just a book that's being talked about a lot. Maybe it's just recently been published. So I produce this assessment for them. And as a scholar yourself, you'll understand the criteria I'm using here. I'll put this on screen, and I'm going to make a video explaining this later, but it's the same kind of process. I actually have a video which goes through this kind of process step by step, but I will put this validation report of mine on screen in this video. Viewers will be looking at it now. And then later on, I'll make a video just about this actual report. So you can see that I have an actual system for doing this. I have a system for checking
Yes.
my sources. And like you, I'm sensitive to issues like dates. It's very interesting. One time I was looking at a source, and there was something a little bit unusual about the wording. I'm sufficiently familiar with Google Books that some things tip me off to the date of the work, And one of them is typeface, which I am absolutely certain that you would know. I'm certain that you, like me, are now quite familiar with 19th century typefaces as opposed to 20th century typefaces, especially late and early 21st century typefaces. And you know, when you're looking at one of those books on Google Books, which says it was published in 2010, and it's actually
Yes.
someone's reprint of something written in 1850. And you know, because
Yes,
of the
run into that several
typeface,
times.
they haven't changed the typeface. Right, right. Or you
Even the
look at the
titles
publisher.
sometimes. 18th century books are like, I found a huge, like,
Oh,
enormous
the
titles.
the 18th century ones are hilarious. Absolutely. They think, well, I've got a whole page. I might as well use half of it for the title. Yeah, that's right. By the time you finish reading the title, you're thinking, well, I
Yeah,
must
you
be
finished
halfway
the
through the
whole book
book by
basically.
now. Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. I know. You just think, well, how much time do those people have on their hands? There are other little tells as well. Sometimes the typeface might be modern, but you look at the publisher and it says Library of Alexandria, and you think,
Yeah.
okay, right. And then you know that Library of Alexandria is the brand name of one of these cheap presses, which actually churns out works which are out of copyright now and says, oh, they're preserving them for
Yeah.
the public good and for historic value and that kind of thing. Fine. But that means that you can't trust the publication date. The
Yeah. So,
typeface might be
yeah,
modern,
2010,
and they
2020,
say they published it in
2024.
2010, but yeah, this is a reprint of, and I mean, they say that in the blurb, but you know, the kind of people whose idea of research is typing a word search into Google Books and taking a screenshot, right?
Mm.
So yeah, they're not checking this stuff. And I know that you would be much more sensitive to those kinds of tells, especially given the kind of research, linguistic research in particular, that you've been doing, and looking at some of those 19th century sources, definitely some of those 19th century sources, maybe even
Yeah.
18th century sources, when you're doing your lexicographical research and you're trying to look for the earliest instance of this. And in
Yeah.
particular, I mean, I don't envy you the work that you must have to do when you're doing well, never mind a synchronic, but a diachronic lexical analysis. It must be a nightmare getting into the weeds, particularly because with a language like, well, languages which have suffered some form of repression and then revival always undergo some kind of modification, obviously, and
Yeah.
recovery through that process of recovery. And then there are words lost, but the lexicons themselves change, and you have to try and identify which are the reliable ones. And sometimes you need an older lexicon because it's the only one that has this word. And maybe that's okay. But then maybe later on, a more modern lexicon has found some extra source material, and now the meaning has changed.
Yeah.
I'm always very, very wary of that especially if I'm looking into source in a language which I'm not familiar with. At least when it comes to Greek and Latin, I'm pretty adept at doing a good synchronic or diachronic analysis. And of course, I can use lexicons, and there are very large corpora online for doing that. And of course, I know how to use a Greek or Latin corpus in order to do those kinds of studies. But it's a lot more difficult in your case, where you're dealing with a language which spans a classical, for want of a better term, a classical or pre-colonial or pre-diminished
Yeah.
era, and then is revived in the modern era. How do you deal with that?
With great difficulty, really.
Yeah, obviously.
Because yeah, well, like you said, because Welsh has always been around, but it did suffer a lot of decline, and
Right,
but
right.
not even just in people speaking, but in terms of the literature. So if I have to go back to like 1700 sources, most of those will be, or almost all of those will be in English. And the hardest part for me, I found,
Yes.
is the spellings are basically, I think, made up on the spot. So you
Wow.
can't search for it. You have to just like the when I was looking for the origin of the term Cadwallader's dragon that I did a video on.
Yes, right.
Cadwallader is a Welsh name, and translated to English, it has all sorts of variations. So in order to be able to go back and find sources that would even mention something to do with it, I had to use sort of related words like dragon and Henry, like King Henry, because that was sort of related to the term.
Oh, I
So yeah,
see. Right.
yeah,
Was it
the only
used
way I
as a
could do it was
heraldic
using.
symbol?
Well, it was claimed to be a very old heraldic symbol, but it was used by Henry VII, so that was my sort of anchor point to be able to even search for anything, to narrow down the
I
search
see.
even
Yep.
by 1%. I had to have something.
Wow. Well, that's
But
great.
it's
I really
with great
appreciate
difficulty.
you. I really appreciate you sharing this level of detail about your research process, because I do think this is something that history YouTube viewers should be interested in. And I think it's
Yeah.
to some extent beholden on us to encourage that interest. And then again, as we've said before, going forward, I think this is going to be extremely useful for differentiating the serious YouTube channels from those which are becoming stocked with AI content in one form
Yes.
or another. And we
Yeah.
do want our viewers to be discerning. We want them to read our sources as well. I mean, you know, and I know that you're going to put a list of sources. Nearly nobody's going to read it. I put in my sources. Nearly nobody reads it. But we do know that we've done the right thing and our
Yeah.
video is verifiable. And there will be people who do read them, which is great. And sometimes you'll get a comment about that. And I think that
Yeah. I've
going
had those
forward,
before.
hopefully, presence of at least a presence for bibliography, list of references or sources is something that people will start looking for. I really like the fact that, for example,
Yes.
that you cite yours down to the page number level, which is very, very specific, rather than just the placing a list of references, which I
Yeah,
really,
I
really
think that's the
like.
most useful one if people ever want to, if they want to search it, because people have told me before that they've even bought like the book that I reference, which is when I'm always glad to have the page number, because if they want to find that specific thing, they can.
Right, right, absolutely. And you know, of course, I'm not producing academic videos here. Nothing that I produce is worthy of being cited in somebody's high school essay, for example. And you probably feel that you're not producing academic level work in that
Yeah.
sense either, not to be cited. But nevertheless, it's great to be able to give other people a head start on their own research. And I think providing page numbers is just plain helpful for that. And then if
Yeah,
somebody
yeah,
isn't sure, at least they
I
can
have
they
them.
can
Yeah.
verify it more easily.
Yeah, I mean, in order to cite them, I have to have the page number, so I might as well tell them what it was. I don't need to
Yeah,
keep it a
exactly.
secret.
That's how I feel. I feel like I found it anyway. It's not much more effort. And that's why,
Yeah,
as you
which
know,
is
I
what.
put my citations on the screen with the quotation and the page
Yeah,
number. And then then it saves me time with my reference list because, well, I can actually just create a reference list in the video description linking to my reference list on my website. I know I've actually already cited the page number on screen, so people have access to that as well.
yeah, yeah. And it's like I mean, yeah, like I said, if you in order to, unless you're making up off the top of your head, you have to have the source. So I don't. It's why I don't
Mm.
even understand this. You see channels that don't cite
Yeah, I know. That's
anything.
right. Yeah.
It's like, where did this come from? You know, I mean, to be honest, sometimes you can find where it comes from. It's an
Right.
exercise. I don't know where I said. I was on. I think it was when I did a podcast with my friend. I said, because I can do this with Welsh history videos. If you look up the Wikipedia page that the topic is on, you
Mm.
can sometimes find why they haven't cited a specific source because it's
Right.
mostly
I
just
see.
in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a key selling of mine too, is that I have, like you said, like we were talking about earlier, I try to cite as specific as I possibly can,
Right.
with a little in-text citations and the subtitles and stuff. And I would hope, and I've had comments like this before, being like, that they appreciate that there are citations and they sort of wonder why everyone else doesn't have them. And that's
Right.
always like, if I can even have just a few people sort of improve their standards of what they watch, really, by questioning why doesn't everybody just have their sources, even just a general source list without pages or anything, because a lot of places
Yeah.
don't even have, they just have nothing. Like, if everybody cited their sources, like I said, I've had comments being like, oh, I like you cite your sources, notice that other channels, don't really do that. And I've talked to people about that before. If everyone cites their sources, then a channel who doesn't do that at all is going to stand out, hopefully. And you
Right.
can question, like, what are you can, if you don't cite anything, where are you getting this from? The only one question I'd wonder is there is definitely an ability for people to be dishonest, because like you could
Naturally.
just say, yeah, but I mean, that would also, I've seen videos with sources, again, because if it's about Wales, I've read too much at this point to be able, there was a video once that cited a book and I already knew, without actually reading a book, I knew that wasn't in there.
Right. Really. Wow.
Yeah, so there is always an ability. Like, and again, I don't know if people do it in bad faith necessarily, or if they're a bit careless.
Mm-mm.
But it's harder
Right.
to make up like a fake source list, because you can check those. And thanks very much for having me. It's, as you said, super important topic, something I'm really, really interested in. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much.